Hello guys, in this video we're going to be looking at how to model a old school CRT monitor like this. We made one a little bit ago, we had a lot of people requesting how to make this, so here's a quick tutorial on how to make it. Okay, so to begin with, I always like to start with reference. We've talked about this so many times. I use PureRef, and I have a bunch of different images of different CRT screens. The one I'm ultimately going to try and make is something a bit like this. We use this as reference for the image we made a little while ago of an old school bedroom. So this will be the main point of reference, but then I have all these other images just for little details and doodads that I might want to add later on. Okay, so we'll go ahead and start with a cube, like a lot of models, and I'm going to scale this up just to be a bit bigger. I don't really like working small scale, and I'm going to make it a bit wider as well because I'm going to try and mimic or copy this one, and it's quite big and chunky and old school looking, so it goes back quite far. It has a bit of a slope down here as well, so we'll go ahead and use the multi-cut tool just to add in some extra edges. Another one here, and then another one here, I think, and then we'll just start bringing these down and shaping this out. We like to keep it, or I like to keep it nice and simple to begin with, just until the shape's correct. So I think I'm going to go with a shape a bit like this, but it's looking maybe a bit too big. So I'm going to pull that back slightly. Maybe something kind of like this. I think I'll make this a bit shorter. I like to spend a lot of time in this stage normally just to figure things out, make sure everything's looking correct. But I kind of like this shape, so I think I'll go with something like this. And then spend as much time as you need really in this stage, just to make sure that you're getting the shape right for whatever kind of monitor you're trying to make. Okay, so I'm happy with that shape. The next thing I'm going to do is add in the curvature for the front of the screen. So I'll just use the multi-cut tool again for that. And I'm just placing edges kind of haphazardly at this point because I'm not too worried about the topology being a bit messy. So we'll add a bit of a curve to this. That curve might be a little bit too much actually. The screen on these are quite curved, but the front is not so pronounced. But I like that, something a bit like that. And from here we can go ahead and add in more detail. So once I'm happy with the shape, generally what I'll do is, because I need more topology here to add in all the details and cuts and panels and things, is I'll subdivide, but I want to keep this shape. So instead of adding all the edges ourselves, there's a much easier way to do this. I'm going to select all the edges that we would want to keep hard, right, that we would normally bevel if we were subdividing. But you can see if I crease these instead, like that, it holds the shape. The normals are getting a bit messed up, but you can see if I smooth, it's holding the shape for us. And that works the same way if I were to just go to the modeling toolkit and then smooth. It's a good idea though first to make sure you have even topology, or about as even as you can get it everywhere, before you divide, just because we want nice even squares as much as we can. So then if I go ahead and smooth, I'm going to smooth twice in this case because I want a good amount of extra quads to work with. At this point we can go ahead and remove the creasing. And you don't have to do this step, but I like to just harden these edges again because whenever you subdivide, even with creasing, the normals get a bit messed up. That's why this looks a bit soft around the edges. So I just go in and add these back in just so that I can see what's going on a bit better. Just make sure we got them all. Just mesh display and then harden edge. I missed one at the back here. Okay, and you can see now we have this shape, but with more even quads. So the next step is to actually cut in the screen. So let's just go ahead and select all of the ones at the front. And we're just going to do a bevel for this. So we'll select all those front faces. Oh, not a bevel, sorry. We'll do an extrude. And we'll just slowly offset this. Or in fact, actually, something that we ought to do is deselect some of these because we don't want... we need the bezel, right? Or not even the bezel, but the actual structure of the monitor. So just experiment with this, and I like to keep the aspect ratio of these looking pretty square. I think what we'll do is we'll extrude in from this point, so we're just in by one set of cubes, or one set of faces. And then we'll just extrude that a bit to make that a little smaller. Something like that. In fact, actually, no. Okay, this is why we take our time here. I want there to be a bit more bezel at the bottom. Space for buttons and things like that, so I'll do it this way instead. something like that, okay? And then what I'll do is I'll go ahead and extrude in again, and this time I'm just going to go straight back like this. Okay, I want quite a big dip in there, and then I'm going to scale this in because I don't want this to just come straight back. I want it to have a bit of an inset like this with a kind of angular edge. Just looks a bit more interesting than where it's just flat. And again, take your time with this. Check what looks right for you and your reference. I'm going to go with something like that. So we kind of have the base shape going on now. We've got this nice chunky looking screen, we've got an inset. But the next most important step that we need to add is this kind of double curve here, because right now the curvature here is the same. But if you look at the reference, you can see the screen is actually more curved than the exterior shell of the display is. So to do that, we're going to go ahead and select all of the interior faces of the screen itself. I'm going to go ahead and just do a marquee selection to get all those faces. If you don't already have it selected, that is, anyway. And then just deselect any back faces you selected. We're then going to come up to deform, go to non-linear, and then bend. And that's going to create the bend handle, which will already be in place, but the curvature is probably going in the wrong direction like this. So we'll just rotate that 90 degrees. Then we'll start increasing the curvature a bit more, like this. So you can see now how the curvature is a bit more extreme on the inside. I don't think I want it to be quite that much, so I'll probably make it more like -8 or something like that. I'm then going to delete the transforms on this because I want to now add another bend modifier to have the curvature this way too, not just this way. So we'll quickly just reselect those faces. Make sure we've only got those ones selected. And then we'll add another bend modifier. This time I'm going to rotate it this way, 90 degrees in Z, and then I might need to change, yeah, we need to change that. So rotate that 90 degrees in Y as well. And then if we look from this view, we can change the curvature here too. So I'm probably going to do also -8. And that looks great. We've got that double curvature going on, but one thing that's happening now is that this has come a bit too far back. So again, we'll reselect those faces just for the last time. And I'm just going to pull that forward a bit more. Something like that. Maybe we'll scale it up a bit. So you can see now that double curvature is a lot more pronounced. But it looks cool, right? And it doesn't really take too long to do. So now that we have the main components made, really this is where the kind of fun part is. We can start looking at details. One thing I quite like is I think these edges are a bit too sharp. I like to have a bit of curvature in the corners. So I'm just going to go ahead and select all these 4 corners. And then we'll just do a bevel. Not an extreme one. We'll add in a couple segments, just 2, just to get that in there. And that will improve once we subdivide. And again, I'm not too worried about the topology looking unclean at the moment because we'll just fix it afterwards. It's not big of a deal, really. As long as we know it will work for us, then it's okay. And one of the reasons why we subdivided earlier is so that, you know, we're going to have some kind of corner edge here, right, to fix up these n-gons. And because we have a curve here, we want to have enough topology so that we don't get any weird pinching or shading artifacts. Next thing I'm going to go ahead and add is a bevel here. So this isn't just a flat edge. Something like this. And we'll just harden those normals so we can see that properly. And already that looks a lot more solid and kind of cool and old school, doesn't it? So now that we've added that in, I am going to separate out this front panel here because I want that to be a separate piece. And in my reference, you can see here we have this kind of separation part. So let's go ahead and separate this out. What I like to do is just go to Edit Mesh and then Detach. And then afterwards you can come to Edit Mesh and then Extract. I have a little plugin to do that for me, so I'm just going to press that. And now we have this as a separate piece. And I also want to separate out the screen because that also needs to be a separate piece. Basically anything that's going to be a separate material, we want to be a separate piece entirely. So we'll go ahead and extract that too. Next, I want to add a bit of a place for some buttons to go, and I kind of want them to be in the bottom corner, like in my reference. So I'm just going to go to the face select mode, and let's say they come across to here. So I'm literally just going to grab this section, go to extrude, and then we'll just come straight back in like that, and then we can have some buttons in there as well. It might be a little chunky, but again, it's up to you. If you want to have something a bit different, that's okay too. Just match whatever your reference is. I also want to have a bit of a bevel at the bottom here, so we'll select this edge and then just bevel. Okay, and we're really not that far off, you know. Already we've got most of the way there. They're quite surprisingly easy to make, honestly. There is one thing I've realized that I've just forgotten to do, and that is adding a bit of curvature to this entire front of the model. And don't worry, that is kind of easy to fix, actually, if that happens to you. So literally, because everything's on top of each other and lines up already because we made it as one piece, we can just recombine it, go to edit mesh, and then merge. Okay. And then like we did earlier with the screen, we can select just some of these front faces, or in this case I'm going to do vertices because it might be a bit easier to select the things that we need. And then just deselect anything you don't need, like the screen. Okay, now that we only have these vertices at the front of the display selected, we can then go to deform, nonlinear, and bend again. And we'll rotate it 90 degrees in Z again, and then we'll probably have to rotate it 90 degrees in Y too. And then literally we'll just add a little bit of curvature to the front here. Not much, maybe something like -5. Okay. And that works reasonably cleanly. We've got some of the model coming in on the side here, but that's okay, we can fix that. We'll just delete the history. And anywhere where it's kind of flattened off, we can just select these faces here. Okay, just align the pivot point to somewhere that's flat, or at least flat the way we want it. And then that solves that problem real quick. So deformers are really, really powerful while you're working to get the shapes that you want, you know, and because the topology is nice and even, we don't have to worry about destroying anything. And then now we can go back and separate out the parts that we need separated again. Okay, and then it's just a matter of going to edit mesh and detach again, and then we can extract out these parts. Okay, problem solved. Next, let's look at adding a bit of a vent on the side here, because that's what my one has, so I'll show you a quick way to do that. What I like to do is create a cylinder, and I'm going to make this the same size as the vents that I want. I also like to reduce the size of these, or the divisions of these, down to 8, because it can get a little bit heavy, and they're going to be small, so I'm not worried about these having lots and lots of detail. So I'm going to shrink it down to the size that I want one of the individual vents to be. Maybe something like this. And then what I like to do is just select one side of this, extract it, and then bring it out to the length that I want the vent to be. So it's almost like we've made two ends of it, right? So I want these to be relatively long. Maybe something like this. And then we select them two. We select the two that we made and then combine them. Then we can select the cut off edges on both sides and then just bridge those. And that creates the kind of shape of our vent. What I then do is select all the faces except for these exterior ones and delete. Essentially what we're making is like the hole punches for the vents, and we're going to use this to build out everything else. So once I have one, I'm just going to press Control 1 to isolate that. And I probably want to have maybe 10 or so, we'll see. What I'll do is just Control D to duplicate. I don't want too much of a gap between each one. And then I'll press Shift D just to repeat action. Maybe we'll have something like this many. I'll press Control 1 again just to come back to get out of the isolated view to see how this looks on our screen. And yeah, I quite like that, so I'm going to go ahead and combine them. But I think it will make them a little bit longer. Not to something like this. Okay. Now once we've done that, I'm going to isolate that again. And essentially what we need to do now is reverse these. Because right now, if I were to bridge these edges, you can see here we're getting back faces, and that's not what we want. So these are going to act as the inside of our vents. We're sort of building this inside out. So now what I do is go ahead and bridge these edges to connect up all of the holes. Okay, and then I extrude out a little bit in either direction this way. So we're making a panel, really. And then we do an extrude out from these as well. And then I just use the multi-cut tool to add a few edges here so that we have something to bridge between. Like so. And then here we can just fill hole. And you can see we very quickly made a panel to go on the side. Obviously there's a fair bit of topology cleanup to do, and that's what we'll quickly go through and do now. So you can literally just use the multi-cut to drag across like this and add edges along everything. So I like to add a few extra edges here, so when this smooths, it just holds the corner a bit better. Like that. Literally all you have to do now is just go through the process of cleaning up this topology a little bit. I'm not going to have every single edge running across because it will get a little bit dense. So I'll just do 2 at a time, coming to a triangle like this. And maybe this one might have to come out on its own or something like that. That's only happening because we did an uneven number. So if you don't want, if you want the topology to be consistent all the way down, have an even number. Okay, so I'll just time lapse as I clean this up. Okay, now that I've cleaned up the topology a little bit, we can go ahead and add in a bevel. And to do this, instead of selecting all these edges manually, there's a much quicker way to do it. I'll just use the face select mode and double click to select all these inside ones. Hold down Control, go to right click to edges and then to edge perimeter. And then we'll just bevel all these at once. Like so. Okay, so now that we've gone ahead and created this panel, we actually need to integrate it into the model, and that could seem a bit tricky because the number of faces and edges don't quite add up, but we're going to put it around about where we want it. I'm going to have it kinda in the middle-ish, like here. And then essentially what our job out now is to redirect the flow of the topology around this face that we've created. So I'm just going to delete some of them around here. And then we can start bridging these together and thinking about how we're going to do that. What I like to do is anything that's coming to 3 points like this, I'll just merge those vertices into one, just to keep things a bit more simple. And then we can just delete one of these edges here to make this a quad. Like that. And then this is a bit of a tricky way of doing it, but it's just the way I like to work. I like to combine the two at this point, and then I'll take the closest ones, the closest edges that match, and just bridge them. And then I kind of just select everything else and then fill holes. So right now that's a bit of a disgusting mess. We've created a mega n-gon, but don't worry. At this stage, I like to kind of just start cleaning it up. And I'm not too worried about triangles here because this is all going to get subdivided into quads anyway. So I'm not going to be too pure about it. I'm just going to connect up the edges that I can. 2 points that make sense. Like so. And if you want to make the topology as clean as possible, you absolutely can do that. But for the purpose of this video, I'm just going to keep it pretty simple. So I'll just time lapse while I clean this up. Okay, now all we need to do is flip this over to the other side. We don't want to have to redo this ourselves. So what we can do is we can find the middle point of this, and then I'm just going to use face select to delete one half. The half that we haven't got the vent on, of course. And then I will duplicate that. And then in the X, I'm going to make that -1. Freeze the transforms, combine, edit mesh, and then merge to make that back into one piece. And now we have that vent on both sides. And we're one step closer to getting this finished. So what I'm going to do now is we have a few edges here. And these need to be panel lines. So what I could do is just leave them like this with nothing on the inside. But then that won't look very accurate when we come to actually bevel or subdivide this model. It won't really look like a panel line. So we need to do some work here. So I'm going to select this entire edge. And then extrude in a bit. Like that. Again, I'm not too worried about this looking really clean. And then I'm actually going to take this entire edge and I'm going to pull it forward a bit, because I do want there to be a bit of a noticeable gap. I don't want this to be like a hairline, panel line or something like that. Then again, I'll do the exact same. We'll just extrude that in a bit. And then to fill this gap in here, because we have a bit of a gap, what I'll do is extrude again, and we're going to come forward and embed that into there now, so there's no light gaps, right? Okay, so that's actually the base of the model done. What we can do is go ahead and add in a few little buttons. So we could create a cube and just start putting them in here, but what I like to do is just reuse things. So I'm going to duplicate this, go to face select mode, and I'm going to select some of these parts. So I'm going to select the faces I want to keep, go to select, then inverse, and then delete. So now we already have some parts in place. I'm going to extrude this out a bit, just directly forward. And then maybe I'll add an edge in the middle here, so that this comes out a little further forward, so it's a bit stepped. And then what I might do is just reduce the size a little bit, so there's a bit of a gap around it. That just looks a little bit more interesting. And then we can do the same again. I'll just duplicate that, select just the faces I want, select, then inverse, and then delete. Maybe we'll scale down a little bit first to begin with. Extrude out again to the same point, then add another edge, and then extrude out again. Like so. So we've added two kind of button looking things in there. And again, you can go into more detail if you want to. This is just a quick tutorial on how I made my one previously. Last thing to do is to add a little bit of a stand. So you could have one that sort of can pivot on a point. I like to just have this look kind of stationary, like it's a really old school monitor from like the 80s or something. Maybe they were swiveling back then, but I didn't exist, so I don't know. I want it to come out a little bit further, be quite wide so it looks real sturdy. And then we'll have this come down a little bit. And then I think I also want this to have a kind of beveled edge at the front like this, just to give it a slightly more interesting shape. And then maybe we can add some edges across here as well to bring this up, so it just looks a bit more interesting. And then we'll harden those edges. You can see here we have like a nicer shape up the front, like that. And then I want a little bit of a gap, so we'll do something like this. Then we'll just create another cube, scale that up. Okay, and I just want to make sure that this sits nice and flush. So we'll snap these vertices to the bottom here, and then we'll do the same to the bottom here. Okay, and then I'll select everything, press set the pivot point to the bottom of the stand, and then we'll bring it up to sit on the grid. And that is essentially how you create the same display that I did, just in a much sort of quicker format, I suppose. Last thing to do is to go ahead and we'll clean up this topology real quick. Literally, I will just select the vertice and then weld that here. And I'm not too worried about this causing any issues. And then we can just delete these interior edges to make those quads. Okay, and now all we need to do is add bevels. So let's go ahead and select all the edges that we want to keep hard. Like so. I like to do this kind of one set of edges at a time sometimes, because sometimes there's less of a gap between certain parts and it will affect the overall distance of any like bevel you can add. So like for example there, so if I were to just select these ones, you can see we can add a bit more of a bevel. I want this to have not a particularly sharp edge, that would look a bit weird. So that will act as holding edges there, and then we can do the same here. Okay, and then the same in here as well, but you get the point. So I'll just time lapse through the rest of this while we finish up adding the bevels to the screen. Okay, so that's all the bevels added, so last thing to do is just select everything, press 3 on the keyboard to smooth preview, make sure everything's working fine, and there you go. That is how you create a CRT classic kind of monitor in a pretty short amount of time in Maya. Thank you very much for watching. I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions, please do let me know. We'll probably go on and turn this into a bigger tutorial maybe next week or later on. I'll show you guys how to texture this, add the CRT screen effect, and also how I created that room render as well with the sort of early 2000s, late 90s sort of feel to it. So yeah, thank you very much for watching. Like and subscribe, and let us know if you have any questions. Thank you. Bye-bye.